Hey, welcome back to Space Thoughts. I know it's been probably over a month since I actually did a video here, so I want to sit down this morning and talk about something that's really been kind of on my mind over the past month or so, and that has to do with this idea of rule-based systems for outer space activities, especially with regards to commercial and national security. We hear this a lot in the media and in panels and NGOs talking about this idea. Well, we need a rule-based order, and it's become almost a buzzword that really I don't think people have really sat down and thought about it. And this really, a lot of this comes back to a conversation I had, on social media a couple months ago, where somebody just pointedly asked me, "Do you believe in a rule-based system for outer space?" And I thought about it, and I said, "No, I don't." And he got all huffy and everything, accused me of being the equivalent of Vladimir Putin and Satan, pretty much, and then promptly unfollowed me. And that's fine. But my answer wasn't so much to troll or to stir up controversy as was really, looking at the current state of international law, looking at what's going on in world events, and really looking at the reality of what does how would a rules-based system for outer space be implemented, and how would it actually be executed? And I think, given the realities of how we see things happening in the terrestrial domain, with international law and rules and such, I just don't think it's something that could actually be created. And I'm going to explain that in this video, but this one will probably be a little bit longer than most of them, so I'll get right to it. So this whole idea of a rules-based system basically would be under the guise of international law. Now, I have a lot of problems with international law. I have been literally thinking about international law almost every day for the past 20 years or so. And the more I think about it, the more it gives me a headache, because it's kind of like quantum mechanics or time travel. You just think it's just so vague and fluid and just so many variables to it that it's very hard to really solidify it. And that's when I really came to the point that international law, it really isn't a body of law. When we think of law, we think of something that is our rules or bright line statutes or case law precedent that basically sets down, this is the rule, and it's something that can be enforceable because of what we call sovereign authority. And that's something we see in domestic situations like here in the United States and in other sovereign nations throughout the world. However, international law doesn't have sovereign authority. I think a Yale professor once introduced one of his international law class by saying that welcome to the class on law that doesn't really exist, and it doesn't exist because there is no sheriff. In other words, there's nobody to really enforce it. And people will come back and say, well, there is enforceability, there's political blowback. Yeah, there is political blowback, but there really isn't. But politics is politics, and it isn't substantive enforcement. So really, international law is a vapor. During my international law class in my third year of law school, my instructor introduced it with this meme. Yeah, we did memes back then, except these were on paper and not on computer, basically saying international law is like trying to nail Jello to a tree. And that was basically a statement by one of his former international law students. And my international law professor is a great guy. I mean, very brilliant. He's an independent scholar right now, specializing in maritime. And just a wonderful person, and he's still a friend today. But that meme kept on running through my head, throughout these 20 years that I've been thinking about it. But I've kind of coined a new term in the sense that it's really like international law is like fog. You can hold Jello. You might actually be able to hold Jello against a tree and maybe try and nail it, and you might actually have some success. But international law is more like fog. In other words, it's there, but if you grasp it, it really isn't there. It's still there and you're constantly trying to grasp what it is. I think this really is emphasized when I look at my textbook from international law, my case book from 20 some odd years ago. It's over 1,000 pages, and that was way back then. We're talking about a case a case book that's probably about 25 years old, this current edition. So I mean, I imagine right now with everything else that's been succeeding in international law, that's gotten a lot bigger since then. So it's really hard to put an idea what international law is. So if you can't really have something that doesn't have sovereign authority, in other words, the means to actually impose these rules upon sovereign states, you really don't have law. And how are you going to make rules? I mean, we have quote unquote rules through treaties and stuff here in the terrestrial domain, but again, they're very hard to enforce. States abide by them because it's in their state interest to abide by them, or in some cases in their state interest not to abide by them. For example, we have the Russian Federation now with the disaster that's going on in Ukraine, basically, violating international law, quote, international law left and right, humanitarian domain, in maritime with the blockade off the coast of Ukraine that's threatening a world famine. But really, but there is no international body enforcing the rules saying you can't do that, you got to stop. Russia basically looks at us and say, you know what, we don't care. And oh, by the way, we have nuclear weapons. So every time they, we threaten, this idea of violation of international law or basically stopping them, they rattle the nuclear saber and everybody gets quiet again. So really, there is no force in that. So then you have the People's Republic of China, on the other hand, who has this little thing going on in the 9-dash line section of the South China Sea, where they are building these islands and claiming sovereign territory, even though they are parties to the UN, to UNCLOS, the United Nations Law on the Conference of the Sea. And but again, nothing we are doing, there is no affirmative sanction or no affirmative force or ability to force a compliance with UNCLOS. In fact, it's interesting because when we talk about the Russian Federation, the PRC, it's a good cop, bad cop situation. The PRC kind of plays good cop in the sense that they work within the system. They promote the idea, oh yeah, we're a member of the world community. We believe in international law. We've signed all these treaties, and then violate them. Well, and basically try and change them from within. They get within the body of international law and the international community, and they're basically trying to change it from within through the use of customary international law. Then you have the Russian Federation, which they basically are more belligerent. They're the bad cop, where they basically said, you know what, we don't care. We're gonna do whatever we can. We're gonna do whatever we want. Well, look at the ASAT demonstration they performed last year, which I still believe was a violation of international law. They basically did it and came out and said, you know what, we don't have to. There's no rules against this. And oh, by the way, these things in the Outer Space Treaty, it doesn't apply. We're going to do whatever we want. And again, what did we do? In my opinion, the U.S. kind of acquiesced and rewarded them for this behavior by making an arms control concession with this unilateral ASAT testing ban that they announced back in April. And again, that's a personal opinion that I hold very strongly. So the idea is, if you're going to make rules in space, how are you going to enforce them? Now, warfighters rules are very important to them. The clearer the rules, the more they can, the better they can actually work. I mean, warfighters receive their directives from the top down. From the commander in chief to the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the field officers, and execute them. However, the field commanders have to make decisions in the field where they can't go back to Washington or the Pentagon or their superiors. They got to make decisions in the field. So if they have the clearer the rules are for them in that situation, the easier it will be for them to actually execute those, appropriately respond to or address these situations that arise. However, the rules aren't very clear all the time, and that's because international law is very vague. And how are you going to enforce them? Now they have JAGs, judge advocates, lawyers who basically interpret the law operationally for commanders in the field. However, it's basically it's a gut. Sometimes it's a legal call, but the commander in the field still has to make the decision. And again, if he or she makes the wrong decision, it's going, he or she could face repercussions for it, but they got to make the decision. But the idea that these rules are clear, that they're enforceable, is very difficult. Because, for example, say if a field commander made a decision and the international community gets all upset about it, the U.S. will be on the hook for it. But the U.S. government can basically, will basically push back against it. A lot of noise will be made. But where is the sanction? Where is the punishment? Where is the penalty for violating that law? Same thing with what's going on in Ukraine, especially with these blockades and these human rights violations. Where's the sanction? Where's the penalty? And this gets back to the idea of what's going to happen with a quote rules-based system in outer space. Under the current paradigm, there really won't be any sanction for it. So really, is that rules-based system going to be effective? Is it going to be a real rules-based system? And I don't think it is, and specifically because of the fact that it doesn't have that idea of sovereign authority. In other words, the authority to tell states what to do. In other words, if you states sacrificing sovereign authority to the rules, to international bodies, to let the international bodies govern in this particular area, or basically to enforce these rules. And that's a touchy issue because people, because individual states do not want to give up sovereign authority. They will give it up if it's in their state interest in certain circumstances, but they really don't want to, in a sense, give up that sovereign authority wholeheartedly to an international body that may have its own political agenda and that would work against them in the future. And unfortunately, I think I see a lot of this in trending. For example, I see this in space traffic management. Space traffic management, space situational awareness is a huge deal, a huge issue right now. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of back and forth on how this should be implemented. Some of them are talking peer-to-peer. In other words, each individual state has its own system, and we cooperate with other states in terms of, supporting this idea of space traffic management through space situational awareness, which the U.S. through United States Space Command actually does through these memorandums of understanding it has with many individual states, including the Russian Federations and the People's Republic of China. However, there is a school of thought out there that says, we need this, quote, central authority to basically take over space traffic management from the states and make this international body and imbue it with the power to actually create this idea of, to actually implement this idea of space traffic management. And that bothers me because, you see NGOs sometimes pushing this, and that's problematic because these same NGOs and the same group of academics also at the same time support this, are absolutely emphatic that, we got to abide by the Outer Space Treaty. And I mean, it's almost like the Outer Space Treaty is written in stone. And if you really look through the Outer Space Treaty, especially if you read back into the records of the actual negotiations of the Outer Space Treaty, the whole idea of the Outer Space Treaty was was to allow states to retain their sovereignty at all costs. And that isn't actually written in there, but it's implicit in there. A really great example is in Article 6, which basically is the authorization and continuing supervision provision, contains that provision for non-governmental space activities. It gives the states the ability to do it. It says, states can allow its citizens to perform these space activities, but we're not going to tell you how to do it, and we're not going to interfere with it. But you just got to make sure it's consistent with international law. Okay, that's fair enough. The state basically retains sovereignty to license it and supervise these non-governmentals as in a manner it sees fit, instead of a central licensing scheme and authorization scheme. And it also gives it the responsibility to watch those activities as well. However, one of the dangers of this idea of central authority, say for space traffic management, say this central authority, which now has sovereign authority over the states, thinks it sees a situation where future space activities by, say, the United States or another country might cause potential harmful interference, or just basically create a problem. It could basically try and assert that authority over a state's Article 6 authority and say, look, we know you're going to license, you're going to license and authorize this, but because of the potential impact of space traffic management, A, we want more information about this, and B, we might override that authorization and licensing and basically say you can't do it. Now, that's an extreme example, but it's not out of the realm of possibility once you give an international body sovereign authority. Another danger is political nature. I mean, these international central authorities will be made up of individuals representing multiple states, and if states have a beef against another state, say the United States, it could use that power or that authority to actually basically how can you say, detriment the United States, especially in commercial space activities and national security space activities, just out of political spite, and just because it can. So again, having a central authority with that type of sovereign authority is a dangerous thing. And again, I think this is why the Outer Space Treaty basically says that basically preserves the idea of sovereign authority in the individual states. And in fact, I think anybody who really promotes this idea, tries to promote the idea of, granting, these types of international bodies sovereign authority, and at the same time says, oh, we absolutely believe in the Outer Space Treaty. I think that's basically it. They cancel each other out, because the idea of the Outer Space Treaty, in my opinion, is for states to preserve the sovereignty of states and set some guidelines to actually creates international norms, true international norms through some of the provisions, Article 6 being one of them. But to say that these sovereign bodies can come in would actually be a violation or outside the scope of what is not only treaty law, but also customary international law or customary international norms. But again, you see the same I want my cake and eat it too approach, where I want this international body with sovereign authority, but I also believe wholeheartedly in the Outer Space Treaty. And it doesn't work that way. Another example where I've seen this is a group that I'm involved with as an observer, dealing with lunar activities. They want this. They basically are ginning up all these potential guidelines for lunar surface activities by individual states, and they are basically coming into the point saying, well, we need this. I think we need the central authority. And my point is being, unless that central authority has sovereign authority given to it, actually sacrificed by states and given to that central authority, it's not going to play. How are they going to be? How's it going to be enforced? How are they going to enforce these activities? And again, I think the central authority would actually be infringing on the Article 6, and actually the Article 8 responsibilities and rights of individual states. So in other words, it really could violate international law. And in the case of the U.S., since the U.S. has ratified the Outer Space Treaty, it could actually be unconstitutional in a sense. And I think that's a very possible ruling that could be had if this ever came to pass and an issue like this came up. So that's why I don't really believe this idea of a rules-based international system can be created, because it's that idea that these international law doesn't have sovereign authority. International bodies don't have sovereign authority, and you don't want to create international central authorities that have sovereign authority over states, because it will be contrary to state interest. And really, given great power competition right now, I mean, there are two prevailing views in the world: that of democracy or basic free enterprise, and authoritarian rules. So the question is, in these central authorities, whose worldview is going to prevail? And if this idea of rules-based, whose worldview is going to prevail? Is it going to be a democratic free enterprise system, or is it going to be an authoritarian system that prevails? And really, that is kind of the underlying struggle right now with this idea of great power competition, and reason we're having all these problems with the Russian Federation, the PRC, and its proxies, and versus the West on the other side. This is one of the reasons I don't think rules-based system can exist. So you're going to say, well, you're talking about anarchy. No, I'm not. We have these things called, the U.S. has been initiating, called the Artemis Accords, which now has 20 signatories to it. And the Artemis Accords will build on the Outer Space Treaty, build on this idea of individual state sovereignty, but create guidelines in the future as outer space activities progress. And I really think that's what we're going to see in the future. When space activities, lunar surface activities, space resource activities become more prominent, you're going to see technical practices and standards come into play. They're actually going to be accepted by the international community, but they'll be accepted and may actually become customary international law, but with the idea that the states still retain their own individual sovereignty to enforce them through their these rules and standards through the activities of not only their government agencies and the military, but also their non-governmentals. So again, it's really it's a really touchy issue. And again, I go back to that kind of discussion I had with that individual on social media, who was very upset that I didn't believe in a rules-based system. He wanted a rules-based system where everybody is forced to do it and can be sanctioned. And I don't think that is something that's plausible, especially if you say you believe in the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty is not an authoritarian document. It preserves the sovereignty of individual states. It doesn't grant any sovereign authority to the UN or any international body. And that's, so for that reason, those rules aren't enforceable. I think the future is things like the Artemis Accords, which is doing very well right now. But I think, again, great power competition, this contrary view of how the world should work, there is going to be bumping heads for, probably for the next several decades. And we'll see how it turns out. And again, I think that's one of the reasons U.S. needs to get back to the moon, along with its allies and members of the Artemis Accords, to basically, start setting the example and setting up this new idea, these new guidelines, these new standards, this new era of customary international law. So that's all I have for you on this beautiful summer day. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, regrettably, you're in winter, but you're almost halfway through it. Again, I want you to stay safe and I want you to stay healthy, and I'll talk to you next time.